As a quick review, these boot camp sessions follow along with the format of the Land Trust Standards and Practices, which is a body of guidance that's sourced from the conservation community and codified and maintained, if you will, by the Land Trust Alliance. The standards and practices are comprised of 12 standards that address important topical areas that are common to land trust practice, and the first half of them are pertain to all nonprofit organizations, and the latter half are specific to land trusts. And the standards also easily organize into what we call buckets, and those topical buckets are governance, financial management, which we've covered in our previous sessions, land transactions, and stewardship. The standards addressing land transactions are standards 8, 9, and 10. Since this is an introductory course, I do want to briefly mention that land trusts protect property in two major ways. The first is through ownership of property, which in legal terms is called the fee interest, not related to money, but that is the word for ownership of property, and land trusts that own property are responsible to care for that land just like any private landowner. The second way that land trusts protect property is by acting as the watchdog organization for private property, which is restricted from development. And this is called a conservation easement and sometimes a conservation restriction. In most cases, land trusts holding conservation easements or conservation restrictions do not actively manage those lands, but they monitor them to ensure that the landowner complies with the restrictions in them. So it's typical that you'll hear your organizations distinguishing between your fee properties and your easement properties because the way that you steward them is different. Some organizations might have mostly one or the other kind, but during the acquisition or the land protection phase that we'll talk about tonight, both types of transactions require many of the same planning steps and legal review to bring them from concept to closing. Okay, the material today is fairly detailed because conserving a property is a detailed process. And you might ask, if it isn't my role within the board to prepare these transactions, then how much of this do I really need to know? And my answer is that it's a good idea to have a basic familiarity with what the process entails. You can recall from our governance session that the full board is ultimately responsible for overseeing the management and financial stability of the organization. And this includes being aware of new land protection projects, ensuring that proper due diligence has been completed, and ensuring that your organization is equipped to fulfill its stewardship responsibilities for the property before voting to accept that property's acquisition. And to bring this concept home, we'll return once again to Standard 3, which addresses board accountability. And the final practice in that, the final practice in 3D says that it's the full board's job to review and approve every land and conservation easement transaction. Now, it's often the case that boards initially hear about a land protection possibility early on. They might discuss the merits of further developing a property transaction and whether or not to incur project planning expenses, including the cost of legal and environmental investigation. The board might vote to order an appraisal or incur some preliminary expenses. And during project planning, the board might receive progress reports at each of its meetings. But regardless of whether or not any of that happens, your board will make a final review and vote prior to closing on any project, at which time you should have available lots of information about the project, including the results of site visits, analyses of conservation values, and due diligence items like the title investigation, all to help you make your decision. As you can see on this slide, there are exceptions, and large, well-staffed organizations might delegate, they don't always, but they might delegate the function of approving a land transaction to staff or to a committee. But even then, the full board should be well briefed in a timely manner on any newly protected property. Here's an example of a resolution to accept a conservation easement or a conservation restriction. prepared in advance of a board meeting in anticipation of a final vote to accept. And as you can see, the resolution documents the board's conclusion that doing the project is consistent with the Land Trust's mission and project selection criteria and will confer a public benefit. And then further down in the resolution, there's language about the organization's confidence that the transaction is feasible and that the organization has the resources that it needs to live up to its stewardship obligations. You'll note in the final paragraph of this example that the board's vote came before the attorneys agreed on the final language of the easement agreement. So this particular resolution was made on the contingency that no substantial changes would be made to the description of the conservation values, prohibited uses, and reserve rights that are contained in the draft language that was provided to the board prior to the vote, and that all other due diligence and documentation required by the organization's policies would be completed prior to closing. So how would you as a board member, and how would the full board, many of whom will have not had insight into the many steps and detailed information collected on the project, how will it know that it can make these findings of mission consistency, public benefit, and etc.? The Land Protection Committee, or the persons that are responsible for preparing the project, should provide the board with sufficient information about the project, including a description of the conservation values and why they meet the organization's project selection criteria, maps, photos of the property, and information about the project structure and its costs, as well as the results of title investigation and other due diligence. In addition, for fee property acquisitions, so for property that you'll own, the board should have at least a general idea of what type of management it's going to conduct in connection with the property, such as installing a trail or a viewing area, as well as any management needs to protect the organization's interest in the property, such as boundary marking and signage. So there should at least be a preliminary plan for what the organization is going to do with the property. It should be clear why the organization is taking ownership of the property. So here's one example of a project summary, which details the nature of the project, its location, maps of the property, including a survey, an aerial, and a topographical map, as well as a situational map that shows where the property is, relative to other protected properties. The summary reports on title work, environmental review, management needs, and projected short and long-term expenses. So ideally, this, like all information provided for board discussion and vote, should be distributed at least 3 days prior to the meeting to allow for full review. Now, I've worked with boards who find the information about conservation projects to be very sensitive, and they don't always like to distribute written information until the project is assured of closing. There are ways to deal with this and still get the board the information it needs. One way might be to project the information during a meeting and allow ample time for everyone to read it, but I would then pause for maybe about 10 minutes so people could get familiar with the information. Sometimes adding a watermark of confidential is helpful, and asking board members to delete or destroy all copies following their review. I've also seen occasions where if the public comes to meetings, the board takes property protection discussions into executive sessions. So those are some strategies, but whatever your process, it's really important to ensure that the board's review of a transaction and what it saw prior to voting is documented in its minutes. And this makes clear that the board exercised oversight of this important function. And ideally, the documents themselves, like this summary, become part of the board's record of its meeting. We'll now turn to the specifics within the standards and practices. This is going to get pretty granular, and don't worry, there won't be a test. But hopefully this will be helpful when you're next considering a land protection project with your board and wish to refer back to the information that we're covering tonight. There are basically 3 phases to a property transaction. Number 1 is the selection of the project. How will you know what to protect, or whether the specific project being considered is worth the organization's time, money, and perpetual care, right? Because acquisition is just the first part of it. We have to take care of it forever. The second phase is project planning, which is all of the investigation and legal work needed to make sure the project is fully vetted, sound, and can achieve the conservation goal of the project. And the third phase is closing on the project and the filing and record keeping work that's needed to fully complete the project and begin the journey of stewarding it in perpetuity. So Standard 8 is about that first phase, project selection, and I'm reprinting the text pretty much verbatim on this slide. It's all about having processes to help land trusts identify the projects or types of projects they believe are most critical. For some land trusts that are working in only one town, this might be a list of actual projects, right? So you might have considered what projects are undeveloped in your town and tabulated them. For others, the priorities might be resource related, such as farmland protection, a farmland protection organization prioritizing working farms and identifying those, or land with prime agricultural soils. An organization might have maps showing these priorities. It also will likely have a procedure for selection of projects, including written criteria that help determine whether or not a proposed project is worthwhile. Some organizations use a ranking analysis to come up with a score that assesses the project's fit. So I've seen that too, and often there are forms. The requirement here under number 4 that public benefit be documented is one reason that I showed you the example resolution containing the board's finding of public benefit, because if you adopt a resolution like that, you show that you can make a clear showing of public benefit, and also I guess query your board to actually think about what the public benefit is of a transaction. So here's just an example of how a land trust might use mapping to identify its strategic priorities. This is a map showing a portion of Kent, Connecticut that identifies parcels within forest cores and the connecting lands that link them. The cores are green, the connecting lands are yellow. There's the Appalachian Trail in red, kind of bisecting the map on a diagonal, and the Housatonic River beside it. And you can see hash marks kind of in like a light tan that show where land is already protected to help further focus this on the best opportunities for conservation impact. And here's an example of project selection criteria, also from Kent, although I have to say many community land trusts have very similar criteria. So I've just highlighted a few that are pretty common, including the potential for public recreation, parcels that adjoin or are near to existing protected areas, wildlife habitat, farms. So, there are variations of these. They tend to track pretty closely to a broad list of criteria that would be probative of conservation value. All right, so in addition to meeting a land trust selection criteria and its priorities, no project should go forward without at least one physical visit to the property. And the site visit is one more way to ensure that the project meets project selection criteria by providing ground truthing to what might have been seen on maps and GIS. The site visit provides the chance to assess the quality of the natural resources there and to evaluate any threats to those resources, such as the risk that invasive plants might pose to wildlife habitat, and also to identify any risks associated with the project that might include like risks of encroachment, like risks of losing the project, not so much risk to the conservation values. So encroachment, environmental liability, other things that could be costly to the organization. All right, also important to project planning is the concept that each transaction should be individually planned, which importantly includes a close look at the perspective and potential stewardship needs that are unique to the project. An obvious need is annual monitoring, of course, but monitoring a small, simple property is not at all the same prospect as monitoring a large, complicated shapefile. And beyond monitoring, there's also the potential for encroachment and trespass and the potential costs that are associated with that. So for fee properties, you're going to want to consider the cost of any management activities that are planned. But looking, for example, at a conservation easement property, prospective stewardship costs could be low for an easement with very few reserve rights, that's easy to monitor, and has a low potential for encroachment. Say a 10-acre parcel with no structures, no reserved rights, easily ascertained boundaries, and no neighbors, right? That would be a pretty easy one to monitor. And think of that as opposed to an easement that is 450 acres, irregularly shaped, bounded by several subdivisions that are under development or have new people moving in, and there are reserved rights to build 3 homes and recreational facilities in floating areas of the easement, right? None of us want that easement, but if we have it, we know that that easement has a high likelihood of requiring substantial stewardship expenses in the future. And then on the flip side, looking at a fee property, prospective stewardship costs could be low for an easy to monitor, forever wild property bounded by state forest and requiring no ongoing management with no public access planned, or they could be very high for a property with a house being renovated as a wildlife education and research center, right? So an improved property where you intend to take and manage a building. And maybe that education center also has 10 miles of trails with interpretive signage, yada, yada, project demonstrations, much more costly project, right? So project planning is really going to require a comprehensive look at what it's going to take you to steward that project. And finally, closing out Standard 8 is a practice that is focused on protection partnerships and collaborations, and basically sets forth some areas that should be clarified and documented to ensure that there's sound protection of the land and avoid disagreements and dysfunction after closing. So, some of those concepts might include the details of the project, setting that forth in a partnership agreement. Maybe setting forth who's financially responsible for project costs and who's financially responsible for stewardship and management after the project is done. So that was a lot. And I want to take a pause to get any of your questions before we move into Standard 9. So I'll come off the share. And I see something in the chat.
It says, Gabby says, in what ways are land trusts legally bound or constrained in terms of their choices around use and management of fee properties? By contrast, other private landowners are not required to steward in any particular way other than regulatory, for example, around wetlands, et cetera. So what's different for a land trust?
Okay, well, it's a really good question. And my answer, I think that answers may differ around this, but my answer would be that as a land trust, when you protect a fee property, you're looking at the natural resources and the conservation reasons that you want to protect the property. And I think that having that intention in mind when you take ownership does impose a duty on you to protect those conservation values and to really put that first and foremost. So let's move away from the trail for a moment. I believe that as landowners of properties, that as conservation landowners of properties, that we as land trusts do have that obligation to look after those conservation values and make sure that they don't deteriorate, and to use them in a way that make them ecologically helpful and fitting in with the ecological system. Not saying that very well, but that is one concept. The second thing I would say to that is that generally speaking, we're purchasing properties or we're getting donations, that people are giving in lieu of taxes, and that by using those funds to protect property and to buy property or own property, that imposes upon us an obligation to use the property for public benefit. So I would say that by making that use of public dollars, that we have a commitment back to the public, a charitable trust type commitment to make sure that the properties are doing what they're intended to do, providing a public benefit through the protection of their conservation values. And sometimes that might include providing public access, not necessarily, but if it fits, if it's not in opposition to the conservation values, something that we might consider based on the source of the funding that led to the protection of that property. So those are just two thoughts that I have in response to that question.
So I heard you saying there's kind of an ethical standard, and I certainly appreciate that. And then to some degree, there's a legalistic standard as a charitable organization. But so on the other hand, if we were going to do a responsible forest thinning project, or maybe in our case at Hilltown, if we're considering partnering with local indigenous communities who might be interested in harvesting off of those lands. In other words, if our board feels that our choices are around stewardship, obviously we're not going to put in a housing development or something like that, but we're within our rights legally as a board to make decisions that are commensurate with our stewardship obligations, and yet kind of broadly defined in terms of what interventions we're allowed to do on fee properties. Thanks.
Yeah, and I would say it's going to be very case by case, but you should be aware also that some protection deals come with some restrictions. And so, just be aware that there may be deed restrictions on properties that are protected. Sometimes those deed restrictions come from the funder. If a property is protected with state funds, sometimes public access is required. Sometimes certain activities are prohibited. And sometimes donors will impose some restrictions as well. So something to look out for. But I appreciate your comments on that.
Another question from Hilltown. Pat asks, how is the value of a conservation easement assessed?
Just wanted to know how you arrive at a value of it, of a conservation easement.
Well, as far as the land trust, most land trusts that I know don't book a value for a conservation easement. In fact, the consideration would really be that it's more of a liability, although they just don't show a value on their balance sheet for conservation restrictions. On the taxpayer's side, however, and we're going to kind of dive into a little bit of detail on this. On the taxpayer's side, when they make a donation of a conservation restriction, they're required to get an independent appraisal that would show the fair market value of what has been given up in placing the restriction on the property.
No, I don't know, Pat, too, if you're talking about a situation where your land trust might be considering purchasing an easement, purchasing a conservation restriction, then you would be looking at probably needing an appraisal as part of your due diligence to determine that you're not overpaying. But as Connie said, the appraisal of a conservation restriction is essentially evaluating the difference between the before value, what the property was worth without restriction, and what it's worth after, once it's restricted. And the difference is the value, appraised value of an easement.
Great. Does that answer your question?
Okay. So if the property had development potential, and then it's going to be conserved, is that development potential subtracted from the assessed or the appraised value?
Yes. So what Rob was describing is the appraiser would do a before and after. So they would appraise the property as if it could be developed, and then they would get a value for the property when it can no longer be developed. And so I just saw the comment in the chat that it's important to get an appraisal from an appraiser who's familiar with conservation easements, and many are not. So this is all kind of diving into, some of what we're going to hear about next in Standard 9, but maybe not in so much detail. So I appreciate that. And, I guess, one of the things that you should do when getting your own appraisal is that make sure that the appraiser is familiar with the valuation of easements. And that would be if you as a land trust were going to purchase an easement. And the same would be true on the landowner's side, although it's not your responsibility, to hire the appraiser for that landowner. They need to get an independent appraisal. So they are the client of the appraiser. Okay, so we'll move into project planning and due diligence with Standard 9, ensuring sound transactions. And sound transactions, meaning those that will be enforceable and provide conservation benefit in perpetuity, that are really safe from challenges, including legal challenges and other threats. The first two parts of this standard deal with getting the expertise needed to do the project. And again, I'm using the text from the standards and practices on these slides, but I will provide context and interpretation as opposed to just reading them. The land trust should have legal representation for each and every project, period, exclamation point. Please make sure that legal counsel sees due diligence results and reviews draft legal documents before they're finalized. So absolutely, yes, have a lawyer. The land trust also might benefit in some cases from the expertise of other professionals to fully investigate whether a project is feasible or determine the extent of risks and their ability to mitigate them. So this might include engineers, maybe ecologists, organizations that provide grants, loans, and other financing for conservation. So make use of your experts. And then the flip side to obtaining independent legal advice for the organization is ensuring that the other parties have independent representation as well. The ethical need to refrain from even giving the impression that the organization is offering legal advice, that it could manage somehow to act in both its own interest as well as another entity's interest. It's so important to avoid that it's best practice really to put in writing the recommendation to landowners that they have their own counsel. And note that this will give your organization some protection against a future claim by a landowner that the land trust assured it that it could get a deduction for a land or easement gift, or the amount that the land trust somehow told them that they would be able to get a certain amount for a deduction. And it will also protect you against any claim that the land trust exercised undue influence or that somehow the landowner wasn't acting in their independent interest when it gave the when it made the donation or sold you property for conservation. So moving further into sound transactions. An important part of project due diligence is environmental investigation to identify risks, including potential liabilities. And the first steps of this might include that site visit that we talked about in Standard 8. And during a site visit, it's possible to make a physical inspection of the property and look for any red flags, really. But depending on what you find, you probably won't stop there. For example, past human occupancy might mean there's a buried oil tank or other potential contamination of the soil or the water. Older structures on the property could harbor hazardous substances like asbestos or lead. Past farming might have contaminated soils with herbicide residues that might need restoration prior to hosting a community garden, say. Land use practices on adjoining or neighboring properties can also impact the property's environmental resources or pose continuing risks. So in these and other cases, public record searches interviews with landowners, and finally outside expertise in the form of like a phase 1 assessment might be necessary. And the title investigation can also provide helpful information about the history of what happened on the land. So those are just a few sources that you might look to in conducting environmental due diligence. Due diligence also includes making sure the property's boundaries are known, monitoring land and easement properties, and enforcing conservation restrictions that encumber, especially those that encumber some but not all areas of a property, can be really difficult if the boundaries are unclear when one is on site. And consider that if it's difficult for you as a monitor to know the land and easement boundaries, then it's likely difficult for those that are obligated to respect the boundaries to know where they are. So the best case is to have a survey map and to have the map reflect lasting physical monumentation, such as iron pins that often mark coordinates on a survey. If surveys include obvious on-site physical landmarks, such as stone walls and structures, this can also be really helpful in making sure that it's easy to read the survey map when you're on site at the property. And the survey map can then be used to post further boundary markers if that's part of your land trust stewardship practice, right? So a survey for every property that, that you are looking into, that you're protecting. Conservation easements or conservation restrictions are a special conservation tool. They're strictly regulated by the IRS. And to satisfy the statutory requirements and Treasury Department regulations, they must contain certain clauses related to their perpetual ability to protect the property's conservation values through the restrictions placed on it. While many organizations start out with an easement template, the template should be tailored each and every time to identify the conservation values being protected and allow only uses and rights that will not impair the conservation values of that individual property. Restrictions and permitted rights should also be able to be monitored. So think about this if you're considering provisions that are really difficult to enforce. Like there used to be this blanket in the template prohibition on using fertilizer or using herbicides and pesticides. And while that I think is well meant, it might be really difficult for you as a, for the land trust as a monitor to know and to enforce. So think about how you might write that in an easement if it's something that is really needed to protect the conservation values. As important as it is to have a qualified attorney represent the land trust in each transaction, this is doubly true for conservation easements. So your attorney, like the appraiser that should be knowledgeable about these kinds of transactions, your attorney should be knowledgeable about conservation easements and be able to ensure that the agreement is drafted consistent with current practice and will be perpetual and will be enforceable. And then even so, land trust should review internally on their own behalf the final draft of an easement for consistency with the conservation purposes text of Section 170H of the Treasury Department regs. So it does behoove you to take a look at what that says. You'd never memorize it, but for each and every easement deal, it might make sense just to refer back to 170H and make sure that that the easement is consistent. And here I just wanted to ask Rob to say, say a brief something, because in Massachusetts, there's an additional layer of state regulatory oversight, and that is not something that I am familiar with in my practice in Connecticut. And I'm also not sure about how that might work in New Hampshire and Maine. So I'm just going to pass the floor to Rob for a moment to talk about that.
Yeah, just very briefly, in Massachusetts, there's a regulatory requirement that the state has to review and sign off on every conservation restriction, whether or not the donor or whether or not the landowner is claiming any tax deduction. It's not about the tax deductibility. It's about essentially the public benefit and conservation values of the transaction. And But they end up doing a fairly extensive review, and in fact, it's grown to be a useful partnership. And the conservation restriction, there's a model conservation restriction document that they promulgate with updates frequently, with a lot of input from the land trust community, that serves as something of a starting point for Massachusetts documents. And so just something you may hear about is folks sending the document to the state and waiting for the state to get back with it. It adds, for one thing, it adds weeks, if not a couple months, to the process. So that's something to be aware of. And I don't know, Whit, I believe, is here. I don't know if there's anything special about Maine's process that you want folks to know.
Yeah, there is not a state process or step in that. There are, for people who are looking in Maine, if you're looking for model conservation easements, however, on the MLTN website under the resources section, there are model conservation easements, both MCHT's model easement and the MLCAN easement, which is a group of conservation attorneys in Maine who have created and keep up, maintain a model easement that anyone can use, and use that as a starting point and adjust it from there.
Great, and I don't know if there's anybody from New Hampshire who has a comment, a knowledgeable person about just anything special in New Hampshire.
Okay, so in the case of projects where the organization is buying the property, the standards and practices require that we establish the fair market value of the property in order to help set the purchase price. And so this is where, that getting of an appraiser, an independent appraisal ourselves comes into play. And so, and an independent appraisal really means that, that appraisal is prepared specifically for us as land trusts, as a potential buyer, and the appraisal would state that. As a nonprofit organization serving a public purpose and using donated or grant funding for the purchase, it's not appropriate for us to pay a premium above market value, except in very rare circumstances. And in fact, most land trusts seek to purchase at below market whenever possible. Only under limited circumstances should a land trust purchase a property without obtaining an appraisal. And in these cases, the land trust should get at least a letter of an opinion from a qualified real estate professional, right? So if timing prevents getting a full appraisal prior to purchasing a property, if you need to snap it up, at least consult an appraiser to see, if that appraiser might be able to give you, a ballpark or a range, just to kind of set you in the right place with respect to where the fair market value actually is. And by the way, taking a quick detour, excuse me, from this slide for a moment, if you've heard the term bargain sale, that is when a landowner sells at below market value. And the difference between the fair market value and the purchase price, which is set below market value, can be considered a charitable donation. So that is often a strategy that land trusts and landowners will use when the landowner needs to get some money, but may not need to get all of it, may be able to make use of a charitable deduction in connection with the project, as well as receive some funding. As another aside, you might notice that I'm jumping around within standard 9. So we went from E to H, and we're going to backtrack now to F. The order of the standards and practices gets a little wonky towards the end. There's a lot of practices in this standard, and I'm attempting to cover the development of a transaction sequentially rather than go in strict order of the standards and practices. So for anyone that notices that, that's why. For all transactions, conservation easements, and fee properties, a title investigation is one of the most important components of due diligence. And there's several reasons why it is a good idea to begin title investigation as early as possible in planning the project. First, you'll want to make sure that the prospective donor or seller, whomever it is that intends to convey the property to you, is in fact the legal owner of record. Believe it or not, transactions have in the past been negotiated and even completed with closings with parties who had no right to convey the property. That's a problem when that happens. So you want to make sure that you are dealing with the rightful owner of record, and sometimes the landowner doesn't even know. So, you know, like the example that I gave was a case where I think a trust owned the property. So the landowner thought that they owned the property, but they really didn't. Secondly, it's important to ensure that there are no encumbrances on the property that could prevent the intended conservation from happening. So for example, a conservation easement cannot qualify as a perpetual restriction if it's subject to a mortgage and potential foreclosure by a bank. So land intended to be placed under conservation restriction or as a conservation easement must be released from the mortgage or subordinated to the easement, or the mortgage subordinated to the easement before the project can be completed. Another example would be, say, if an adjoining landowner possessed a right of access to build a driveway over land that the organization wants to protect due to its sensitive wildlife habitat. So the land trust might want to try and figure out if they can set that driveway in place, or maybe even extinguish that right, or else they might decide to turn the project down because they can't ensure that they're going to be able to protect that wildlife habitat. Sometimes it's the organization's own access to the property, which might be complicated and need further investigation. So if you're looking at a property for the development of a trail, but your access to the property is from a roadway managed by a homeowners association, for example, you want to make sure that you're going to be able to bring the public over that roadway, over that access, and figure that all out before you actually take possession of the property. While it's best practice to conduct the title investigation early on, it's also customary to update the investigation just before closing, in case any encumbrances were placed in between the initial investigation and the time of closing, which is often months, if not in some cases years later. So this is sometimes called doing a bring down of that title, and should be done like the morning of, just prior to closing. Finally, following closing, it's important to record the legal documents in a timely manner to make sure that the organization's interest in the property is known and protected. All right, practice I of standard 9 is about what to do when the organization sells a property or conservation easement. And note that this can be a good conservation strategy for a land trust that's offered a property, the entirety of which is not critical for protection. So, you know, this is maybe you've heard of the buy, protect, sell model. It's based on this type of scenario where the income from the sell helps to fund the buy, and ensures that the part of the property which is critical for protection is in fact protected. And practice I says that the organization should get an appraisal so it knows the fair market value of what it's selling, unless it's selling to another nonprofit. And when the property is sold and transferred to another conservation organization, the organization should, the land trust that's selling or transferring that property should confirm for itself that the new owner does have the capacity to steward the property in perpetuity so it stays protected. All right, a last concept in standard 9 is not about project planning and due diligence. It's about maintaining essential records after the deal is done. Records that are necessary to ensure the continued protection of the organization's interest. In other words, maintaining your proof that you own the property or that you hold the conservation easement interest in that property, maintaining the proof that you exercise due diligence in investigating and preparing the project, maintaining the proof that you have kept good records afterwards of what you've done on the property, including fulfilling your stewardship obligations of monitoring and enforcement. A record-keeping policy is an important component of this practice. A record-keeping policy is required of all nonprofits by federal law, but additionally helps maintain the regularity of business practices that are necessary to ensure that you could admit those records as evidence in a litigation about the property. And record-keeping policies and procedures, just as importantly, keep us organized and focused and allow for efficiency and accuracy. Documents that are essential to a property's defense are sometimes called irreplaceable documents by the Land Trust Alliance, and they should be kept in a secure manner, protected from damage, which used to mean that we kept them in a locked fireproof cabinet, and then we kept a second set in a separate place just in case all of those protections failed. But with technological improvements, the legal rules of evidence increasingly allow documents that are kept in a digital format to be introduced in litigation. So we're no longer tied to paper originals. An organization must still keep records that are pursuant to a regular business process, protected from theft, loss, inadvertent modification, but provided that these safeguards are in place, it can be adequate to maintain one's files entirely in digital form. And it's still advisable to keep a second set of those irreplaceable documents available and protected in a separate place, even if that's a separate place on the cloud, just in case one's digital storage method fails. And then also important, of course, if you're using digital records, is the regular backup and testing of your storage solution so you can be assured that those will be lasting. Okay, that was a lot. I know. I want to see how close we are to the end. Standard 10 is pretty easy, but let's stop for questions.
I see a question. Gabby, I don't know if your hand is up with a new question, and then Jill.
I apologize. This is the first of these sessions I'm attending, but I saw a question that came up in the last session, and it relates to what Connie was just talking about, which is digital security. I'm the president of a small land trust in Western Maine, and I have a treasurer who is really, really crazy about, oh my God, what's going to happen when the apocalypse comes and our computers melt down. I also have a board member who is a cyber professional. So with that combination of skills on my board, or what features on my board, we have done a pretty ambitious cybersecurity campaign. And if anybody on the call is interested in that, and particularly, not to be a complete nervous Nelly, but particularly given the Russian and Ukrainian situation and how cyber attacks will be something that may come to play, there may be some consideration there. So I'd be happy to share what we've done in our little neck of the woods.
Thanks, Jill. So I don't know if you saw, but that complements what Rob sent around, was it yesterday, Rob, which is there's a practical pointer that the Land Trust Alliance put out on cybersecurity and insurance, and it's it's pretty dense, but very very comprehensive. You're getting questions in the chat now about what land trust you're from. I don't know what your preference is, Jill. Would you prefer to maybe put your contact information in the chat and then have people contact you directly, or is that the best way?
Or if you wanted to send me something that could go out to everybody, I'd be happy
to
do that. Yeah. And what land trust are you with, Jill?
Greater Level Land Trust in the Western Mountains of Maine.
Okay, great.
So we're little, but we are fierce.
That's awesome. That sounds like a really helpful resource. Yeah.
Any other questions? Or should we move on to Standard 10? Home stretch. Standard 10 is about tax law and exists to help guard against abuses of the charitable deduction by bad actors who might try to inflate the value of their donated conservation property. Landowners who donate conservation land or easements are allowed to claim a charitable deduction for the value that they've given up in donating the property, as we've discussed earlier tonight. In order to claim a deduction, landowners must file a form, which is called IRS number 8283, which gets signed by the land trust that has received the donation. The form contains information about the value given up by the donor and is supported by an independent appraisal that the donor procures for themselves. Now, it's not the land trust's job to come up with the value of the donated property, and this is true for other non-cash gifts too, like artworks or vehicles that might be donated to your organization. And in fact, coming up, verifying the value or coming up with the value ourselves would be directly opposed to what we learned about going out of our way to refrain from giving legal or tax advice. However, it is best practice for a land trust to at least review the donor's appraisal alongside Form 8283 to make sure that they're consistent and contain some required contents. It protects the reputation of the land trust community in the face of questions about the abuse of conservation easements if we take the responsibility for ensuring that the landowner's paperwork at least satisfies tax law requirements. And in addition, really, it may put our donors' minds at ease when we offer feedback on unintentional mistakes, because nobody wants to get audited. And an organization that cares about its donors should take steps to help them avoid a stressful experience that they might encounter if they fill out the 8283 in a way that raises some red flags. So specifically, the standards and practices direct land trusts to let prospective donors know that they will have to satisfy some conditions in order to make a charitable deduction claim in connection with their conservation gift. I've tried to make this really dense text more digestible by highlighting certain parts. Land trusts should provide this notice to their donors in writing, always advising the landowner to get his or her own independent legal and tax advice, and with the express disclaimer that the land trust does not provide legal and tax advice. And consequently, the information that you're providing to the landowner should be boilerplate. It should make reference to the applicable portions of the Internal Revenue Code, found in section 170, as I had expressed before. That boilerplate could include at a minimum that the landowner will be required to get a qualified appraisal. And what that means, including rules about the contents of the appraisal, the timing, the appraiser themselves, and the nature of the appraisal contract. And also that the land trust will need to see a copy of the appraisal in conjunction with signing the Form 8283. It can be a good idea to remind the landowner of these requirements as tax season approaches. So if a land trust completed a gift in like February of their year prior, but didn't at that time execute a Form 8283, there are a lot of different practices here. Some land trusts do it at closing and some do it more towards tax time, depending on their appraiser usually and the appraiser's practices. But if it wasn't the case that the 8283 was signed at the time of closing, it can be a good idea to shoot a reminder out to the donor as tax season approaches, so you don't end up with like an April 14th call saying, sign my 8283 and get in an awkward situation where you don't have a copy of the appraisal or the sufficient time to review it. The remainder of Standard 10 is about the responsibilities of the land trust after providing this initial written communication to the landowner before the transaction closes to review the 8283 after the project closes in tandem with the appraisal. To determine that the required contents are in there, each of the form and the appraisal, and that they match. And if the land trust has reason to believe that the information is inaccurate, or if no gift has been made, so if the value is highly inflated or the description is wrong, it should take further action to address this rather than just signing the Form 8283. And it should never sign a blank 8283. As you can see in practice C, some suggested ways of addressing concerns about the Form 8283 include sharing concerns with the landowner. If you have a good relationship with the landowner, you might just say, hey, I'm not sure this is going to fly with the IRS. This is why. Seeking additional substantiation of value. So reaching out maybe to one's own appraiser, a different appraiser, to kind of test out the assumptions that the landowner's appraiser has made. Withdrawing from the transaction if it hasn't closed yet, or simply refusing to sign the 8283. And within this practice C, there's this last item, number 4, aimed at identifying and flagging syndications, which may exist when land is owned by many unrelated parties, represented by a third party who is marketing the deal to the land trust, so different from an individual donor. And land trust should be on the lookout for these kinds of transactions and reach out to the Land Trust Alliance for assistance if they find them that they're presented with something like this or involved in a transaction that may be a syndication. All right, last new bit here and somewhat of a preview to our coming session on stewardship next week. For easements, part of putting together a project is the preparation of a baseline documentation report, or a BDR. BDRs might be used by easement donors as part of their tax return, so and they're required by tax law. So, usually it's not a stretch to get your donating landowner to help you in the preparation of a baseline documentation report. And I want to distinguish here between BDRs and what are sometimes called baseline reports that discuss the condition of fee properties, like ecological inventories. Baseline documentation reports for easements are really, a legal term of art, and they are legal documents as opposed to planning documents. For land trusts, BDRs establish a record of the property's condition at the time the easement is given. And they provide evidence that's useful in any future enforcement matters, and especially in the event of a litigation to defend an easement. BDRs are technical, usually prepared by experts that are able to evaluate the conditions of the conservation values, protected by the easement, and the protective nature of the restrictions that are contained in the easement. And BDRs document these conditions through text, maps, and photos. A BDR should be ready to be signed by both the landowner and the land trust at the closing of the easement transaction, which is why I've put it in tonight's session. It's about stewardship, but it's a component of a land transaction. And following signing of that BDR, that document should be stored in accordance with the organization's record-keeping policy, as it is an essential document and needs to be preserved in a way that would allow it to be admitted as legal evidence. There's lots more to say about BDRs, including their usefulness in monitoring and when they might be updated. But that's really for next Tuesday. So I'm just going to move to my top 5 takeaways for new directors here. Number 1, that land transactions involve many detailed steps. Organizational procedures and checklists can help ensure that everything necessary gets done. And the standards and practices provide a really great framework for ensuring that all of those steps are covered. Number 2, due diligence is really important to making sure you do excellent and lasting land protection. It's worthwhile to be thorough and take the time that's needed, as well as to invest in getting the advice of professionals. Number 3, documentation is key. Board documentation of your stewardship activities, and maintaining credible copies of important project files. Long after we're gone, a judge should be able to tell that we followed all the necessary steps so our properties can stay protected. Number 4, the reputation of land conservation is dependent on sound transactions that are free from abuse of the conservation easement tool. And by now it should be obvious that the standards and practices place a lot of emphasis on how to make sure that our easements are well planned, defensible, and consistent with the law. And number 5, acquisitions are only the beginning. of our responsibility to protect a property's conservation values. So we should have stewardship in mind throughout project selection and planning, and make sure that we forecast and put aside adequate financial reserves. So protecting land is super rewarding. And so that's my advice, to serve on an acquisitions committee if you have a chance. Even if this sounds complicated, it's really fun and very rewarding. So I think that we're over time. I'm sorry, but I'm going to stop sharing, and I can stay a minute more if there are any burning questions.
There was a question from Douglas. What happens if you're reviewing a landowner's appraisal and you think it's too low?
That's really interesting. I mean, well, so when I said we're not responsible for actually making the valuation, you know, I would go into the appraisal and read it and think about, like, I would actually want to take a look at why the appraiser came up with their conclusions, and see if it is, see if those conclusions are well supported. So see if there are actual comps and if those comps make sense. And if you have some knowledge of the, you know, the market and what's going on, and really think that it is significantly lower than it might be, and if you have the kind of relationship with the landowner, you might say, you know, how did you vet your appraiser? You know, it might be worth it for you to, you know, seek the opinion of a second appraiser. You know, I don't know that we have an obligation to flag those quite so much as a wildly inflated valuation, but that's what I might do. If I've worked hard on a project and, you know, then I see an appraisal that I really have to question, you know, the conclusions of that appraiser, or I don't know the appraiser and don't feel confident in their ability to make a fair appraisal, I might go to the extent of reaching out and talking with the landowner. But you're not giving tax advice. So that would be like, that would be the, to me, that would be where my hesitance would be, is that you do not want to be perceived by the landowner to be offering tax advice or recommending that that value might be wrong in any way.
Wow, that was a lot of great content. So thanks everybody for joining us again, and we will be back for our final session a week from tonight. And I will send out the recording and the copy of the slides as soon as it's ready, along with a link to that record keeping toolkit, and anything that Jill sends me as well. So thanks everybody. All right, take care.
Thanks everyone. Have a great week.